Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the marble halls and blood-soaked battlefields of ancient Athens, a world where democracy itself becomes the weapon that destroys the very people who created it. We're diving into the fine catastrophic years of the Peloponnesian War, where the birthplace of freedom transforms into something far more terrifying than any tyrant's palace. Forget everything you think you know about ancient democracy being some noble, peaceful experiment. The truth: you probably wouldn't last a week in this political nightmare where today's hero becomes tomorrow's exile, where the mob decides your fate with a show of hands, and where the same assembly that votes for freedom can vote for genocide before lunch. So before we dive into this democratic darkness together, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're ready for a journey through the twisted corridors of power where liberty and tyranny dance their deadly waltz. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. It's incredible to see who's brave enough to explore these midnight chapters of human ambition with me. Now dim those lights. Maybe grab something strong to drink. Picture the Athenian agora at dawn, the scent of olive oil and unwashed bodies mixing with the salt breeze from Piraeus harbor. And let's step into this nightmare together, the story of how the world's first democracy ate itself alive. Congratulations. You've just woken up in Athens, 41 BCE. The year democracy began its final, bloody feast. The morning sun slants through your modest window, casting long shadows across walls that have witnessed 20 years of the most brutal war the Greek world has ever known. Outside, you can hear the familiar sounds of the city trying to convince itself it's still great. The clatter of pottery wheels, the bleating of goats being driven to market, the sharp crack of shipbuilders' hammers from the harbor. That there's something else in the air today, something that makes your skin crawl even before you understand why. It's the smell of fear masquerading as celebration. You see, today marks something unprecedented in human history. Not just a peace treaty, but the moment when democracy itself begins to turn cannibalistic. The Peace of Nicias, they're calling it, though you'll soon discover that calling this arrangement peace is like calling a tumor healthy growth. As you stumble from your sleeping couch, and yes, it's as uncomfortable as it sounds, basically a wooden frame with some threadbare cloth thrown over it. Your feet hit the cold stone floor. The chill shoots up through your body, a reminder that even in the birthplace of civilization, central heating won't be invented for another 2 millennia. The subtle aroma of stale wine, human sweat, and something you desperately hope isn't rotting fish wafts up from the street below. Welcome to the democratic experiment at its most dangerous. You dress quickly in your chiton. Think of it as a bedsheet with delusions of being clothing, and wrap your himation around your shoulders. The wool is scratchy against your skin, dyed with colors that have already begun to fade despite costing you a month's wages. In Athens, even your clothes are a political statement. Wear too fine a fabric, and you're accused of putting on airs above your station. Dress too poorly, and you're dismissed as having nothing valuable to contribute to the assembly. Democracy, you're learning, is as much about performance as politics. The streets of Athens assault your senses like a physical blow. The narrow alleys between homes create a symphony of chaos. Children shrieking in play, mothers calling them back, men arguing about everything from olive oil prices to military strategy. The buildings lean against each other like drunken friends. their mud brick walls sweating with moisture and decades of cooking smoke. Above it all, the Acropolis rises like a marble crown, its temples gleaming with the wealth extracted from an empire that everyone knows is beginning to crack. But it's the conversations you overhear that make your blood run cold. The Delians had it coming. Someone mutters as you pass a group of men huddled around a bread seller's stall, polluted the sacred island with their very presence. The gods demanded cleansing. You pause, pretending to examine some wilted vegetables while you listen. These men are discussing the recent expulsion of the Delians from their ancestral home as casually as they might debate the weather. An entire people removed from the only land they'd ever known because some priest declared them spiritually unclean. The Athenian assembly voted on it. Of course, democracy in action. Where did they go? Asks a younger voice. Someone who still has the luxury of curiosity rather than cynicism. Atramitium, comes the reply, followed by a shrug that contains entire lifetimes of indifference. Pharnaces gave them land in Asia, probably better off anyway, away from civilized people. The casual cruelty of it takes your breath away. This is how empire works in a democracy, not through the whims of a single tyrant, but through the collective decision of free citizens who vote to destroy lives with the same enthusiasm they might vote for a new public fountain. You hurry past, but the damage is done. The seed of understanding has been planted in Athens. Freedom means the freedom to be absolutely ruthless to anyone who isn't an Athenian citizen. And sometimes, as you'll soon discover, it means being ruthless to fellow citizens too. The agora spreads before you like a stage set for human drama. The ancient marketplace isn't just where people buy and sell goods, it's where democracy happens, where the fate of nations gets decided between haggling over fish and arguing about pottery. Wooden stalls lean against marble columns, creating a bizarre juxtaposition of the sacred and the mundane. The smell hits you first, a mixture of rotting vegetables, fresh bread, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of blood from the meat sellers' stalls. Here, surrounded by the detritus of daily life, you witness the machinery of the world's first democracy grinding its citizens to dust. A crowd has gathered around a man standing on an overturned amphora, his voice carrying across the marketplace with the practiced cadence of a politician. This is Cleon, and watching him work is like watching a master predator who's learned to hunt with words instead of claws. Citizens of Athens, his voice booms with righteous indignation. While we debate the finer points of peace, our enemies in Thrace grow fat on land that should belong to you. The crowd murmurs agreement. Cleon knows exactly which strings to pull. In a democracy, the art isn't in being right. It's in making people feel like their anger is justified, their fears are reasonable, and their greed is patriotic. You push closer, fascinated despite yourself. This is democracy in its purest form. One man, standing before his equals, using nothing but words to convince them to send other men to die. No divine mandate, no inherited throne. Just the raw power of rhetoric unleashed on a crowd that has the collective attention span of a fruit fly. The peace of Nicias, Cleon continues, spitting the name like a curse, asks us to give back what we've won with blood. Amphipolis, that jewel of the northern trade routes, to be handed over like tribute to Spartan dogs. Someone in the crowd shouts agreement, then another. Soon the entire agora is buzzing with indignation. Citizens who couldn't find Amphipolis on a map suddenly convinced that its fate is the most important issue in their lives. This is how it works, you realized with growing horror. Democracy doesn't require an informed citizenry, it requires an angry one. And Cleon is a master at manufacturing outrage. Brasidas may be dead, the demagogue continues, but his legacy lives on in every compromise we make with Sparta. Every concession we grant is a betrayal of the men who died to win those victories. You glance around at the faces in the crowd. These aren't monsters or fanatics. They're ordinary people. Shopkeepers and artisans, farmers and laborers. The kind of people who, in their individual lives, show kindness to their neighbors and love their families, but gathered together, fed a steady diet of fear and grievance, they become something else entirely, something dangerous. As Cleon's speech reaches its crescendo, you notice something that makes your skin crawl. The way people's faces change as they get caught up in the mob mentality. Rational expressions give way to something primal, something hungry. Democracy, you're beginning to understand, doesn't make people noble. It just gives their worst impulses official sanction. The speech ends with thunderous applause, and the crowd begins to disperse. But the damage is done. Seeds of discontent are being planted that will grow into policies of unimaginable cruelty. This is how democracy works in practice, not through careful deliberation or reasoned debate, but through the manipulation of mob psychology by those clever enough to understand which buttons to push. You follow the crowd as they stream toward the mix, the hilltop where the Athenian assembly meets. This isn't just any gathering. This is the culmination of the peace negotiations that have been dragging on for months. The moment when Athens will officially end its war with Sparta and begin the even more destructive war with itself. The mix is a natural amphitheater carved into the hillside, capable of holding the 6,000 citizens required for a quorum. As you climb the rocky path, you're struck by the symbolism. Democracy literally looks down on the city it governs, elevated above the daily concerns of ordinary life, disconnected from the consequences of its decisions. The morning air carries the scent of wild herbs and the distant salt tang of the harbor. Around dunes, citizens argue and gesture as they climb, their voices creating a cacophony of competing opinions. This is democracy in its raw form, not the sanitized version you might imagine, but a chaotic, emotional, deeply human process where decisions affecting millions get made by whoever shows up and shouts the loudest. You find a spot on the stone benches just as the herald calls for order. The speaker's platform, a simple wooden rostrum, suddenly seems like the most important place in the world. From here, men will speak words that will determine whether cities live or die, whether nations prosper or fall into ruin, whether the grand experiment of democracy survives or devours itself. Nicias takes the platform first, and immediately you understand why some men are destined to be politicians and others are destined to be their victims. Where Cleon radiated predatory charisma, Nicias projects something far more dangerous. The appearance of reasonableness. He's the kind of man who can convince you that black is white while making you feel grateful for the education. Citizens, he begins, his voice carrying easily across the assembled crowd. Today we choose between the wisdom of peace and the folly of endless war. A reasonable proposition on the surface, but you're beginning to understand that in democracy, the surface is always a lie. For 10 years, Nicias continues, our young men have died on foreign shores. For 10 years, our treasury has been drained to fund expeditions that bring us glory, but little else. The time has come to consolidate our gains, to choose stability over adventure. The crowd listens with the kind of attention they usually reserve for gossip about their neighbors' marriages. This is what passes for foreign policy debate in a democracy. One man's opinion, delivered with conviction, to an audience that will make their decision based on how the speaker makes them feel rather than the logic of his arguments. But you notice something else. The way certain faces in the crowd remain unmoved by Nicias's reasonable tone. These are the faces of men who have already made up their minds, who have come here not to listen but to wait for their moment to speak. Democracy, you realize, is often just theater performed for an audience that has already decided how the play should end. When Nicias finishes, the applause is polite but lukewarm. Reasonable men rarely inspire passion, and passion is the currency of democratic politics. Then Alcibiades rises to speak, and the entire character of the assembly changes. If Cleon was a predator and Nicias was a reasonable man, Alcibiades is something far more dangerous, a force of nature that has learned to speak. Watching him approach the rostrum is like watching a beautiful storm gather on the horizon. You know it's going to be destructive, but you can't look away. Rostrum. He's younger than the other speakers, perhaps 35, with the kind of classical features that make sculptors weep with envy. His emotion is draped with casual perfection, expensive enough to signal his aristocratic status, but not so ostentatious as to alienate the common citizens whose votes he needs. Everything about him screams carefully cultivated spontaneity. My fellow Athenians, he begins, and immediately you understand why some men are remembered for centuries, while others are forgotten before their bodies are cold. His voice doesn't just carry across the assembly, it penetrates, it seduces, it commands. Nicias speaks of peace as if it were a virtue. Alcibiades continues, his tone conversational, yet somehow intimate, as if he's speaking to each citizen individually. But I ask you, what has peace ever built? What great monument rises from inaction? What empire was ever founded on the principle of doing nothing? The crowd stirs, sensing the approach of something electric. This is charisma in its purest form. The ability to make people want to follow you even when they're not sure where you're going. We stand at the pinnacle of human achievement, Alcibiades declares, his voice rising. Athens is the light of the world, the teacher of nations, the hope of all who love freedom, and we are asked to dim that light for the sake of peace with Sparta. He practically spits the word peace as if it's something unseen. Around you, citizens nod in agreement. You can feel the mood of the assembly shifting, like a sail catching a favorable wind. I have brought you victory before, Alcibiades continues, and now his voice carries the ring of absolute conviction. At Mantina, I forged an alliance that made the Spartans tremble. I turned the Peloponnese against itself and showed the world that Athens need bow to no one. This is the moment you understand the true danger of democracy. It's not that the people might choose wrongly. It's that they might choose based on the beauty of the lie rather than the ugliness of the truth. Alcibiades is selling them a fantasy of endless glory, and they're buying it with the coin of other men's lives. But now, he says, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carries to every corner of the amphitheater, we face a choice. We could accept this peace, this admission of our limitations, this confession that Athens has reached the boundary of its ambitions, this confession that Athens has reached the boundary of its ambition. A moment of silence that feels like the world holding its breath. Or we can reach for something greater, something that will make the poets sing of us for 1,000 years, something that will prove, once and for all, that democracy is not just another form of government, but the destiny of all mankind. The crowd erupts, not the polite applause that greeted Nicias, but something primal, something hungry. You watch faces around you transform as Alcibiades' words work their magic, turning shopkeepers into would-be conquerors, artisans into armchair generals. This is how empires die, you realize with growing horror, not through external conquest or internal rebellion, but through the slow poison of their own success. Athens has become so powerful that it has forgotten the difference between what it can do and what it should do. Alcibiades isn't finished. He never is, my friends. He continues, his voice now carrying the intimate tone of a man sharing secrets with his closest companions. Some of you may wonder why I, who have everything a man could want, wealth, position, the admiration of my peers, why I should advocate for policies that will take me far from the comforts of home. It's a masterly touch, acknowledging the obvious question while simultaneously painting himself as a selfless patriot rather than an ambitious politician. The answer is simple, because I love Athens more than I love myself. Because I would rather die in service to this great city than live safely while she diminishes. Because I believe that you, the citizens of the greatest democracy in history, deserve to reach for the highest prize of all. He pauses again, letting the words sink in. Around you, you can practically hear the sound of minds changing, of reasonable caution giving way to glorious ambition. Sparta offers us peace, Alcibiades says, his voice rising toward its climax. But Syracuse offers us empire. Sicily offers us wealth beyond imagination. The West offers us immortality. And there it is, the poison wrapped in honey, the lie that will destroy everything. Alcibiades isn't just proposing a military expedition. He's selling a dream of limitless expansion, of democracy triumphant over all the earth. He's offering them the chance to be gods. The crowd's roar is deafening now, a sound like thunder rolling across the hills. You watch as 6,000 free citizens commit their city to a course of action that will lead, inevitably, to its destruction. This is democracy at its most seductive and most dangerous. The moment when the people choose their own doom, because it's wrapped in the language of glory. As the formal voting begins, you notice something that makes your blood run cold. The mechanical efficiency with which this decision is being made. No detailed planning, no careful consideration of logistics or strategy, no realistic assessment of the risks involved, just a simple show of hands by men who will never personally bear the consequences of their choice. The ostraca, the pottery shards used for voting, click against each other as they're dropped into the urns. Each piece represents not just a vote, but a life that will be lost, a family that will be destroyed, a future that will be consumed by the insatiable appetite of democratic ambition. You watch Alcibiades during the voting, and what you see chills you to the bone. There's no doubt in his eyes, no moment of reflection about the magnitude of what he set in motion. This is a man who has confused his own desires with the will of the gods, who believes that anything he wants must, by definition, be right. This is the democracy paradox in action. A system designed to prevent tyranny has instead created the most effective tyrant of all, the tyranny of the mob, guided by demagogues who understand that people will choose beautiful lies over ugly truths every single time. The votes are counted, and the result is announced. Athens will make peace with Sparta, while simultaneously preparing for the greatest military expedition in its history. The contradiction doesn't seem to bother anyone. In democracy, contradictions aren't problems to be solved, they're features to be celebrated. As the assembly disperses, you overhear fragments of conversation that reveal the true horror of what's just transpired. My son is old enough to serve now. Finally, a chance for him to win glory like his grandfather did at Marathon. The Sicilians won't know what hit them, probably still using bronze weapons and worshipping trees. This will be over by harvest time. We'll be back with enough gold to make every citizen rich. These aren't evil people making these observations. They're ordinary citizens caught up in the euphoria of collective decision-making, intoxicated by the feeling of power that comes from belonging to something greater than themselves. But their ignorance is absolute. Their confidence is unshakable, and their consequences will be catastrophic. As you walk back through the agora, the normal business of daily life continues around you. Potters shape clay, metalworkers hammer bronze, farmers sell their produce, the machinery of civilization grinds on, oblivious to the fact that the people operating it have just voted to destroy everything they've built. You stop at a wine shop, because if you're going to witness the end of the world, you might as well be drunk for it, and listen to the conversations swirling around you. The topic is universal, the coming expedition to Sicily, discussed with the kind of casual certainty that makes you want to weep. Syracuse won't stand a chance, declares a man whose closest encounter with military strategy was probably a childhood game of knucklebones. One look at our triremes and they'll surrender. I heard the Augusteans have temples full of gold, adds another voice, enough to fund a dozen expeditions like this one. Vespasian will be fighting alongside allies who know the terrain. It'll be like a guided tour with occasional battles. You order wine, the kind that's strong enough to burn away the taste of impending doom, and marvel at the human capacity for self-deception. These people aren't stupid, but they're allowing themselves to believe things that a moment's reflection would reveal as nonsense. This is how democracy dies. Not through external conquest or internal rebellion, but through the gradual erosion of the connection between actions and consequences. The wine cellar, an old man whose hands shake as he pours, leans across the counter and speaks in a voice barely above a whisper. "You know what I think," he says, glancing around to make sure no one else is listening. "I think we're about to learn the difference between being powerful and being wise." You look into his eyes and see something that's been missing from every other face you've encountered today. Doubt. Realist doubt about the wisdom of what's been decided. "You don't support the expedition?" you ask, matching his conspiratorial tone. He shrugs, a gesture that contains lifetimes of experience with human folly. "I support Athens. Always have. Always will. But I remember when we went to Egypt 30 years ago. Golden opportunity, they called it then too. Easy conquest, they said, barely worth mentioning the risks. He pauses to serve another customer, then returns to your conversation. 10,000 men, he continues quietly. 10,000 Athenian citizens and allies, dead in the desert, because someone convinced the assembly that democracy could overcome geography. The weight of his words settles over you like a shroud. This isn't the first time Athens has let ambition override wisdom, and it won't be the last. Democracy, you're beginning to understand, doesn't learn from its mistakes. It just makes them more efficiently. As afternoon fades into evening, you make your way toward the harbor at Piraeus. If you want to understand the true scope of what's been set in motion, you need to see the naval preparations firsthand. The road between Athens and its port is crowded with carts loaded with supplies, officials shouting orders, and citizens eager to catch a glimpse of the fleet that will carry their ambitions to Sicily. The harbor spreads before you like a forest of masts and rigging. Triremes, the most advanced warships in the world, bob at anchor in perfectly organized rows. Each vessel represents the peak of human engineering, a marriage of wood and bronze and human muscle that can cross the Mediterranean faster than any ship before it. But it's not the ships themselves that make you feel sick. It's the atmosphere around them. The docks buzz with excitement that feels almost sexual in its intensity. Shipwrights hammer and plane with the enthusiasm of men building their own monuments. Sailors practice their drills with the precision of dancers preparing for the performance of their lives. Everyone, absolutely everyone, believes they're about to be part of something glorious. You watch a group of young men, probably in their early 20s, examining a trireme's bronze ram. They run their hands over the metal with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts, and their conversation reveals the depth of their delusion. Look at the workmanship on this ram. Syrian bronze, perfectly balanced. One hit from this beauty, and any Sicilian ship just disappears. The whole expedition should take maybe 6 months. Sail out, smash Syracuse, collect tribute from the rest of the island, sail home for the victory celebration. My father served at Salamis. Says this fleet makes Xerxes' armada look like fishing boats. Their confidence is absolute, their ignorance is complete, and their fate is sealed. These young men will be dead within 2 years, their bones scattered across Sicilian beaches, their dreams of glory transformed into a nightmare that will haunt Athens for generations. But they don't know that. They can't know that. Democracy has convinced them that collective decision-making somehow transcends the laws of physics, economics, and human nature. They believe that because 6,000 citizens voted for success, success is guaranteed. As darkness falls over the harbor, torches and braziers spring to life, creating a constellation of flickering lights that reflects off the water. The scene is undeniably beautiful, the kind of sight that poets will celebrate for centuries. But you know something the poets don't. Beauty and tragedy aren't opposites. They're dance partners. You find yourself standing next to a man who's supervising the loading of supplies onto one of the triremes. His face is weathered by years of sun and salt spray, his hands scarred by rope and bronze. This is someone who knows ship, who understands the difference between democratic dreams and maritime reality. First time seeing the fleet up close, he asks. Noticing your expression, you nod, not trusting your voice. Beautiful sight, he continues. But there's something in his tone that suggests he's not entirely convinced. Finest ships ever built, finest crews ever trained. should be quite a show when they sail out. You don't sound entirely enthusiastic. You venture. He's quiet for a long moment, watching his men wrestle an amphor of olive oil into the ship's hold. "I've been sailing these waters for 30 years, he finally says. "Seen a lot of expeditions come and go. The successful ones, they all had one thing in common: realistic goals and careful planning. This one," he trails off, but his meaning is clear. "The assembly is spoken," you say, testing his reaction. "Oh, the assembly's spoken all right," he replies with a bitter laugh. Question is, do the winds and waves and Sicilian armies care what the assembly has to say? It's a profound question, one that cuts to the heart of the democracy paradox. Democratic decisions feel so authoritative, so legitimate, that it's easy to forget they're still subject to the same physical laws as any other human endeavor. Gravity doesn't care how many citizens vote against it. As you walk back toward the city, the weight of what you've witnessed begins to settle over you like a heavy cloak. In a single day, you've seen democracy reveal both its greatest strength and its fatal weakness. Its strength lies in its ability to harness the collective energy of free citizens, to transform individual ambitions into shared purpose. Its weakness lies in its inability to distinguish between what people want to be true and what actually is true. The streets of Athens at night, a different world from the bustling marketplace of morning. Narrow alleys become rivers of shadow, and the sounds of the city take on an ominous quality. Somewhere in the darkness, a dog barks with the persistence of a bad conscience. From an open window comes the sound of a woman weeping, whether for joy or sorrow. You can't tell. You pass groups of men huddled around wine shops and taverns, their conversations a mixture of celebration and speculation. The expedition to Sicily has become the only topic that matters, the lens through which everything else is viewed. Old grudges are set aside in favor of planning for future conquests. Personal ambitions are temporarily forgotten in favor of civic glory. But underneath the surface excitement, you begin to detect something else, a current of anxiety that runs through the city like an underground river. People are trying too hard to convince themselves that everything will work out perfectly. Their laughter is too loud, their confidence too emphatic, their optimism too desperate. This is what democracy looks like when it's in the process of making a catastrophic mistake. Not like a madman raving, but like a reasonable person who's convinced himself that unreasonable things are possible. You spend the night in a small inn near the agora, listening to the conversations that drift up from the common room below. Even here, among ordinary travelers and merchants, the topic is universal: Sicily, conquest, glory, wealth. The democratic decision has become a kind of mass hypnosis, convincing an entire civilization that reality can be voted away. But as you drift off to sleep, one thought haunts you above all others. Somewhere in the darkness, other men are making other plans. Spartans who won't be impressed by Athenian votes, Sicilians who won't surrender just because democracy demands it, the physical world that operates according to laws no assembly can repeal. Democracy has spoken, but the conversation is far from over. Morning brings new horrors disguised as political progress. You wake to the sound of heralds announcing the formal ratification of the peace treaty with Sparta. and the simultaneous authorization of the Sicilian expedition. The contradiction doesn't seem to bother anyone. If anything, it's being celebrated as evidence of Athenian sophistication. We're so powerful, you overhear one citizen explaining to another that we can make peace and war at the same time. That's what separates us from barbarians. They can only do one thing at once. The logic is so twisted it makes your head spin, but it's being embraced with the enthusiasm of revealed truth. This is how democratic self-deception works. Contradictions aren't seen as problems to be resolved, but as events of transcendent wisdom. The formal treaty ceremony takes place in the shadow of the Parthenon, democracy's greatest monument, presenting itself as a witness to democracy's greatest folly. Officials from both Athens and Sparta stand before altars, smoking with incense, swearing oaths that everyone knows are meaningless. The Spartan delegates look like men attending their own funeral. They understand, better than anyone, that this peace is just an intermission in a conflict that can only end with the complete destruction of one side or the other. But they go through the motions because even the Spartans have learned to respect the forms of diplomacy, even when the substance has been completely corrupted. Nicias speaks for Athens, his voice carrying easily across the assembled crowd. Today we choose wisdom over war, prosperity over pride, the future over the past. This treaty represents not surrender, but maturity, the recognition that true strength lies not in conquest, but in knowing when to stop. The words are beautiful, reasonable, exactly what you'd want to hear from a statesman. But you need, as everyone knows, that even as Nicias speaks these words, shipwrights are working around the clock to prepare the largest invasion fleet in human history. The hypocrisy is breathtaking, but it's also revealing. This is how democracy handles cognitive dissonance, not by resolving it, but by celebrating it as complexity. The ability to hold contradictory beliefs simultaneously isn't seen as a weakness. It's seen as sophistication. When the ceremony ends, you follow the crowd as they stream back toward the agora. The formal peace has been declared, but the real action is just beginning. Now comes the hard work of turning democratic dreams into military reality. And the process reveals everything you need to know about how an empire actually functions. The transformation is immediate and total. Within hours of the peace ceremony, Athens begins to reorganize itself for war on a scale that dwarfs everything that's come before. This isn't just about raising an army. It's about reshaping an entire civilization to serve the needs of unlimited ambition. You watch as public spaces are converted into military planning centers, as sacred precincts become weapons depots, as temples become recruitment offices. The boundary between civic and military life doesn't just blur, it disappears entirely. Democracy at war consumes everything in its path, including the very principles it claims to defend. The recruitment process reveals the true genius of democratic warfare. It doesn't rely on conscription or coercion, but on something far more powerful, the willing participation of free citizens who believe they're choosing their own destiny. Young men line up eagerly to volunteer, their faces shining with anticipation of glory. They're not being forced to serve, they're demanding the right to participate in what they see as the greatest adventure in human history. But it's not just the young who are caught up in the fever. Older men, veterans of previous campaigns, find themselves drawn back to military service by the promise of one last chance at immortal fame. Craftsmen abandon their workshops to build ships and weapons. Merchants liquidate their businesses to invest in what they're convinced will be the most profitable expedition ever mounted. The entire social fabric of Athens is being rewoven to support an enterprise that exists. At this point, only in the collective imagination of 6,000 citizens who raised their hands in an assembly, you spend the afternoon watching the logistics of democratic warfare unfold, and what you see is both impressive and terrifying. The organizational capacity of Athens is staggering. Within days, they've mobilized resources that most nations couldn't assemble in years. But the speed and efficiency of the mobilization is also its weakness, because it's based entirely on assumptions that no one has bothered to verify. The assumption that Sicily will welcome Athenian liberation, the assumption that the Italian cities will remain neutral, the assumption that Sparta will honor a peace treaty that everyone knows is temporary, the assumption that Sparta will honor a peace treaty that everyone knows is temporary, the assumption that weather, disease, and the simple friction of military operations won't interfere with carefully laid plans. These aren't small oversights, they're fundamental errors that will doom the entire enterprise. But in the intoxication of democratic decision-making, such concerns are dismissed as the worries of small minds unable to grasp the scope of Athenian greatness. As evening approaches, you find yourself back at the harbor, watching the fleet take shape. What you see is simultaneously the pinnacle of human achievement and the instrument of its own destruction. These ships represent the accumulated knowledge and skill of centuries, the product of a civilization that has learned to bend wood and bronze and human will to its purposes. But they're also floating coffins, beautifully crafted tombs for the democracy that built them. The harbor at sunset is a scene of breathtaking beauty. The western sky blazes with orange and purple. The calm water reflects the masts and rigging like a mirror, and the sound of hammers and saws creates a rhythm that feels almost musical. If you didn't know what you were looking at, you might mistake it for the most glorious moment in human history. And perhaps it is. Perhaps this is how all great civilizations, not with collapse and ruin, but with a final, magnificent gesture that transforms destruction into art. As darkness falls over the harbor, torches and braziers spring to life throughout the fleet. The lights reflect off the water and the bronze fittings of the ships, creating a constellation that rivals the stars above. Somewhere in that beautiful, doomed armada, young men who will never see Athens again are sharpening their weapons and dreaming of glory. Democracy has spoken, and the consequences are about to unfold across the wine-dark sea. Sweet dreams, citizens of Athens. Your votes have been counted, your fate has been decided, and tomorrow the ships will begin to gather for a voyage that will teach the world the true price of democratic ambition. The marble temples still gleam on the Acropolis, the agora still buzzes with commerce and debate, and the machinery of the world's first democracy continues to turn. But something fundamental has changed in the space between one assembly meeting and the next. The moment when freedom chose its own destruction, when democracy voted for tyranny, when the greatest experiment in human government began its long descent into the darkness it was designed to prevent. And tonight, as the harbor lights flicker like funeral candles and the wind carries the scent of ambition and salt spray, Athens sleeps the sleep of the powerful, unaware that power itself has become its most dangerous enemy. The months that follow blur together like a fever dream of democratic madness. You watch Athens transform itself into something that would be unrecognizable to its founders, a war machine disguised as a republic, a tyranny that rules through popular vote rather than royal decree. The shipbuilding reaches a frenzy that borders on religious mania. Every morning, you wake to the sound of axes biting into timber, the ring of bronze being hammered into shape, the creaking of rope and leather as the greatest fleet in human history takes form. But it's not just the scale of the preparation that horrifies you. It's the enthusiasm with which free citizens embrace their own servitude to military necessity. Walking through the harbor at dawn, you encounter scenes that make your skin crawl. Wealthy citizens compete to see who can contribute the most lavish equipment to their ships, treating the expedition like some twisted version of a religious festival. Captains mortgage their family estates to afford bronze rams and gilt figureheads. Ordinary rowers volunteer their life savings to ensure their vessel will be the most beautiful, the fastest, but the most likely to return covered in glory. This is democracy eating itself from within, not through external pressure or internal rebellion, but through the willing sacrifice of everything democratic societies are supposed to protect: individual liberty, rational debate, the separation between public necessity and private ambition. You overhear a conversation between two ship captains that crystallizes the madness. "I've spent my daughter's dowry on Thracian oars," one boasts, "worth every drachma. They'll give us an extra half knot in rough seas." "That's nothing," his companion replies. "I've commissioned a bronze ram from the best smiths in Aegina. Cost me my house. But imagine the stories they'll tell when we use it to smash through a Syracusan hull." These men aren't being coerced into bankruptcy. They're racing toward it, competing to see who can sacrifice more for the collective dream. Democracy has convinced them that personal loss is patriotic virtue, that individual suffering is the price of collective glory. The truly terrifying part is that they're probably right. Spring arrives with news that makes the entire city hold its breath. Envoys have returned from Egesta with confirmation that enormous wealth awaits any expedition capable of claiming it. The reports are intoxicating: temples overflowing with gold, treasuries that could fund Athens for decades, a population eager to exchange Syracusan oppression for Athenian liberation. You're in the agora when the envoys present their findings to an impromptu assembly, and watching the crowd's reaction is like watching people discover they've won a lottery they didn't know they'd entered. The excitement is so intense it becomes almost physical. You can feel the collective pulse of 6,000 hearts beating faster. See the gleam of avarice transform ordinary faces into masks of barely controlled greed. But you're beginning to understand how democratic deception works. It's not that the envoys are lying, exactly. It's that they're telling the truth through a lens so distorted by wishful thinking that reality becomes unrecognizable. Yes, Egesta has wealth. Yes, they're willing to pay for Athenian assistance. But the gap between has wealth and will make Athens rich is vast enough to swallow entire fleets. The envoys describe Egestaean temples gleaming with silver plate, and the audience hears unlimited funding. They mention tribal alliances willing to provide local support, and the crowd imagines enthusiastic populations ready to rise against Syracuse. They report that Sicilian cities are divided against each other, and Athens concludes that conquest will be effortless. This is how democracy manufactures consent for its own destruction, not through lies, but through the systematic amplification of everything people want to hear and the systematic suppression of everything they don't. After the presentation, you follow the crowd as they spill out of the agora, their conversations revealing the complete triumph of fantasy over fact. Did you hear? The Augustinians have enough gold to pay for the entire expedition twice over, and they're promising to provide cavalry and local guides. We'll barely have to fight, just show up and collect tribute. Best part is, once we control Sicily, we can use it as a base to conquer southern Italy, maybe even Carthage. After that, the progression from helping an ally to conquering the Mediterranean happens so smoothly that no one seems to notice the logical leaps involved. Democracy, Eurocracy, doesn't just permit mission creep, it actively encourages it, because expanded goals justify expanded resources, which create expanded opportunities for glory and profit. But it's not just the strategic delusions that horrify you, it's the casual way the assembly discusses the fate of entire populations. Syracuse, a city of perhaps 200,000 people, is treated like a problem to be solved rather than a community to be considered. The possibility that Syracusans might prefer their current government to Athenian rule never enters the discussion. Democracy, it assumes that everyone secretly wants to be democratized, whether they know it or not. As summer approaches, the final preparations reach a crescendo of organized chaos. You spend your days wandering through a city that's transforming itself into something unprecedented, a democratic war machine operating at maximum efficiency. Every citizen has become a cog in an apparatus designed to project Athenian power across the Mediterranean. They've done so voluntarily, enthusiastically, convinced that they're participating in their own liberation rather than their own enslavement. The irony is so thick you can taste it. Athens is destroying democracy in order to spread democracy, abandoning its principles in order to impose them on others. But the irony is lost on the participants, who see only the glorious surface of their collective enterprise. Then, on a morning that starts like any other, the machinery of democratic paradise begins to reveal the serpent coiled at its heart. You wake to the sound of shouting in the streets, not the usual bustle of commercial activity, but something sharper, more urgent. The voices carry notes of panic that make your blood run cold, and as you dress hurriedly and rush outside, you discover that Athens has encountered its first taste of the paranoia that will eventually consume it. The Herms are gone. Not all of them, but enough to send shockwaves through a city that's convinced itself it's about to embark on a divinely blessed mission. These sacred statues, squat stone pillars topped with the head of Hermes and sporting prominent phalluses, have stood guard at doorways and intersections throughout Athens for generations. They're more than religious symbols, they're tangible links between the human and divine realms, protectors of travelers, guarantors of safe passage. And someone has systematically vandalized them in a single night. The damage is surgical in its precision. Every face is being chiseled away. Every phallus is being broken off, leaving behind mutilated remnants that look like victims of some supernatural assault. The message is unmistakable. The gods are not pleased with Athens, and someone wants to make sure everyone knows it. The crowd gathering around the nearest damaged Herm speaks in hushed tones that gradually rise to something approaching hysteria. It's an omen. The gods are warning us against the expedition. No, it's sabotage. Spartan agents trying to undermine our morale, or oligarchs The aristocrats never wanted this expedition anyway. Could be the Circassians themselves. They have agents here. What you're witnessing is democracy's immune system activating against a perceived threat. But like many immune responses, the cure threatens to be worse than the disease. Within hours, suspicion and paranoia begin to spread through the city like a plague, turning citizens against each other in their desperate search for someone to blame. The official response comes swiftly. Rewards are posted for information leading to the vandals. Immunity is promised to anyone willing to testify. And the entire machinery of democratic justice begins grinding toward a solution that will, inevitably, be worse than the original problem. But you're beginning to understand something that terrifies you. This isn't an accident or an external attack. This is democracy beginning to cannibalize itself, using the very mechanisms designed to protect freedom to destroy it. The investigation won't seek truth, it will seek satisfaction. The trials won't pursue justice, they will pursue catharsis. The punishment won't fit the crime, it will fit the collective need for someone to suffer. As the day progresses, the paranoia metastasizes. What began as concern about religious vandalism evolves into a comprehensive conspiracy theory that encompasses every fear, every grudge, every unspoken anxiety that's been festering beneath the surface of Athenian society. You're in a wine shop when the first accusations are made, and watching the process unfold is like watching reason commit suicide in real time. The conversation starts innocuously enough, a discussion of who might have had the motivation and opportunity to vandalize the Herms. But within minutes, it's expanded to include secret oligarchic plots, Spartan gold, religious subversion, and a dozen other threats that may or may not exist. It's obvious, declares a man whose confidence is inversely proportional to his knowledge. The aristocrats never wanted democracy in the first place. They're trying to sabotage the expedition so they can blame its failure on the people and restore the old ways. Makes sense, agrees another voice. Who else would know exactly which Herms to target for maximum psychological impact? And the timing is perfect, adds a third conspirator. Right before we sail, when morale is crucial. Classic oligarchic strategy. The logic is simultaneously compelling and completely fabricated. There's no evidence for any of it, but it fits so perfectly with existing prejudices and fears that evidence becomes irrelevant. Democracy, you realize, doesn't require truth to function. It just requires consensus, and consensus can be manufactured from nothing more than shared anxiety and mutual suspicion. By evening, the investigation has taken on a life of its own. Citizens are encouraged to report not just suspicious activity, but suspicious thoughts, suspicious associations, suspicious absences from public gatherings. The line between civic duty and paranoid delusion disappears entirely, replaced by a collective hysteria that feeds on itself and grows stronger with each passing hour. You watch from the shadows as neighbors denounce neighbors, as friends betray friends, as the bonds that hold society together dissolve in the acid of democratic suspicion. This is what happens when a free people become convinced that their freedom is under attack. They destroy it themselves, systematically, enthusiastically, in the name of protecting it. The first arrests come at dawn, and the names on the list make your blood freeze. These aren't random suspects or obvious criminals. They're prominent citizens, respected leaders, men whose only crime appears to be having enough influence to be worth destroying. The paranoia has found its targets, and democracy has found its scapegoats. Among those arrested is Alcibiades himself. The irony is so perfect it feels scripted. The man who convinced Athens to undertake its greatest military adventure is now accused of sabotaging it before it can begin. The evidence against him is thin to the point of transparency. Guilt by association, rumors of impiety, the kind of circumstantial case that would collapse under scrutiny in any rational legal system. But this isn't a rational legal system anymore. This is democracy in crisis. In crisis, democracy operates according to different rules. The standard of proof isn't beyond reasonable doubt. It's satisfying to the mob. The goal isn't justice, it's catharsis. The punishment isn't proportional to the crime, it's proportional to the collective need to feel that something decisive has been done. You're in the agora when Alcibiades makes his defense, and watching him speak is like watching a master artist create his final masterpiece. He knows he's fighting for his life, but he also knows that traditional logic and evidence won't save him. Instead, he appeals to something deeper and more dangerous. The democratic ego. Citizens of Athens, he begins, his voice carrying easily across the packed marketplace. I stand before you accused not of any specific crime, but of being the kind of man who might commit such a crime. I am guilty not of evidence, but of excellence. I am condemned not for what I have done, but for what I am capable of doing. It's a brilliant rhetorical strategy, acknowledging the weakness of the case against him while simultaneously turning that weakness into a strength. He's not just defending himself, he's defending the principle that democracy should judge actions rather than character, evidence rather than suspicion. But you can see in the faces around you that brilliance isn't enough. The crowd wants blood, not rhetoric. They want someone to pay for their anxiety, their fear, their growing suspicion that the gods themselves have turned against them. Alcibiades may be innocent of vandalizing the Herms, but he's guilty of something far worse in the eyes of democratic justice. He's guilty of being extraordinary in a system that increasingly demands conformity. I have served Athens faithfully, he continues, his voice rising with passion. I have brought you victory at Mantinea, alliance with Argos, the promise of empire in Sicily. I have asked for nothing but the chance to serve, and I am repaid with suspicion and slander. True words, every one of them, but truth, you're learning, is just another tool to be used or discarded as democratic expediency demands. The same citizens who cheered Alcibiades' proposals for the Sicilian expedition now view those very proposals as evidence of dangerous ambition. Success breeds suspicion, and suspicion breeds the need for sacrifice. The trial, if it can be called that, becomes a referendum not on guilt or innocence, but on whether Athens will be ruled by fear or by confidence. And fear, as always in democratic societies under stress, wins by a landslide. It is where the true genius of democratic tyranny reveals itself. Instead of simply condemning Alcibiades, the assembly decides to let him sail with the expedition and stand trial upon his return. It's presented as a reasonable compromise, a way to avoid disrupting military preparations while ensuring that justice will eventually be served. In reality, it's a death sentence disguised as due process. You understand immediately what this decision means. Even if the citizens voting for it don't, Alcibiades will sail to Sicily under a cloud of suspicion. his authority undermined, his future dependent on the success of an expedition that was always more fantasy than realistic military planning. If the expedition succeeds, he'll return to face trial by a people who will resent his success. If it fails, he'll return to face trial by a people who will blame him for their disappointment. Either way, he's dead. But the true horror isn't what this decision does to Alcibiades. It's what it reveals about democracy itself. The same system that elevated him to power is now destroying him, using the same mechanisms, appealing to the same citizens, operating according to the same principles. The only thing that's changed is the mood of the mob, and in democracy, the mood of the mob is the only law that matters. As the assembly disperses, you overhear conversations that reveal the depth of the transformation Athens has undergone. Good riddance. Never trusted him anyway. Too clever by half. Should have done this years ago. Men like that are dangerous to democracy. Now maybe we can have some normal leaders, people who understand their place. The preference for mediocrity over excellence, for conformity over brilliance, for safety over achievement. These are the values of a democracy that's lost confidence in its ability to handle exceptional individuals. Athens is choosing to diminish itself rather than risk being challenged, to embrace limitations rather than possibilities. This is how democracy dies, not through external conquest or internal rebellion, but through the gradual triumph of fear over ambition, mediocrity over excellence, the comfortable lie over the inconvenient truth. The fleet finally sails on a morning that should have been glorious, but feels instead like a funeral. You're among the crowds that gather at Piraeus to witness the departure, and what you see is simultaneously magnificent and heartbreaking. This is the largest, most expensive, most carefully planned military expedition in human history, and it's setting forth under circumstances that virtually guarantee its destruction. The ships themselves are works of art. Sleek triremes with bronze rams gleaming in the morning sun. Their hulls painted in colors that reflect the wealth and ambition of their builders. Each vessel represents the accumulated skill of generations, the product of a civilization that has learned to harness wind and wave and human energy for its purposes. But it's the atmosphere surrounding the departure that breaks your heart. What should be a celebration of Athenian power has been poisoned by suspicion and paranoia. Families say goodbye with forced smiles that can't quite hide their uncertainty. Sailors who should be singing work songs instead mutter prayers and touch amulets for protection against unseen enemies. Alcibiades stands on the flagship's deck like a man attending his own execution. His face is composed, his bearing dignified, but you can see the knowledge in his eyes. He's sailing toward his own destruction, and he knows it. The expedition he championed has become his prison. The adventure he promised has become his nightmare. As the ships clear the harbor and set course for Sicily, you watch Athens wave goodbye to its future. Not just the future represented by the thousands of men aboard those vessels, but the future represented by the democratic values that sent them forth. The Athens that returns from Sicily, if it returns at all, will be a different place, shaped by defeat and hardened by betrayal, suspicious of excellence and hostile to ambition. The democracy paradox has reached its inevitable conclusion. A free people have voted themselves into tyranny, not through the rise of a single dictator, but through the systematic destruction of everything that made their freedom possible. Months pass like a slow-motion disaster. News from Sicily arrives in fragments, initial successes followed by setbacks, easy victories followed by unexpected complications, confident reports followed by requests for reinforcements. Each dispatch reveals the gap between democratic expectations and military reality, between what the assembly voted for and what the expedition actually encountered. You watch Athens struggle to process information that contradicts its fundamental assumptions. The Sicilians aren't greeting their liberators with flowers and gratitude. The Italian cities aren't remaining neutral. The Syracusans aren't collapsing at the first sight of Athenian triremes. Instead, they're fighting back with the desperation of people defending their homes against foreign invaders. The cognitive dissonance is stunning. Citizens who voted enthusiastically for easy conquest now scramble to explain why conquest is proving difficult. The problem can't be with their original decision. Democracy doesn't make mistakes. Only individuals do. So the blame shifts to the generals, to the soldiers, to anyone except the system that sent them forth based on wishful thinking and democratic hubris. Nicias is too cautious, becomes the conventional wisdom. He's wasting opportunities, letting the enemy regroup when he should be pressing his advantages. The soldiers aren't fighting hard enough. They've gone soft from too much Athenian luxury. The allies aren't providing the support they promised. Treachery. Obviously, every explanation except the obvious one, but the expedition was doomed from the moment it was conceived. That democracy had voted for an impossibility and then been surprised when impossibility proved impossible to achieve. Then comes the news that transforms disappointment into catastrophe. Alcibiades has defected. Rather than return to face trial on charges everyone knows are fabricated, he's fled to Sparta and offered his services to Athens' greatest enemy. The man who convinced the assembly to invade Sicily is now helping the Spartans destroy the very expedition he created. The reaction in Athens is immediate and total. Shock gives way to rage. Rage gives way to paranoia. And paranoia gives way to a purge that makes the original home investigation look like a polite disagreement. If Alcibiades could betray Athens, anyone could. If the architect of the Sicilian expedition could turn traitor, no one can be trusted. Democracy's immune system, already hyperactive, goes into complete overdrive. Citizens denounce each other with the enthusiasm of people who've discovered that betrayal is patriotic duty. The assembly passes laws making it easier to prosecute treason, easier to confiscate property, easier to execute citizens whose loyalty is deemed insufficient. You watch in horror as Athens systematically destroys everything that made it great. The intellectual freedom that produced Socrates becomes dangerous individualism. The economic prosperity that funded the empire becomes evidence of corruption. The political openness that defined democracy becomes a security risk that must be eliminated. This is the final stage of the democracy paradox. The point where freedom becomes so afraid of its enemies that it becomes its own worst enemy. Athens is still technically a democracy. Citizens still vote. The assembly still meets. The forms of self-government are still observed, but the substance has been hollowed out, replaced by the machinery of mutual surveillance and collective fear. The news from Sicily, when it finally comes, is worse than anyone imagined. Not just defeat, but annihilation. The entire expedition, ships, men, equipment, dreams, swallowed by the hostile waters and hostile shores of a land that refused to be conquered. Thousands of Athenian citizens dead or enslaved, their bones scattered across Sicilian beaches, their names forgotten in the rush to explain how such a disaster could have occurred. But even in the face of complete catastrophe, democracy finds a way to avoid responsibility. The fault lies with traitors like Alcibiades, with incompetent generals like Nicias, with fickle allies and hostile gods and bad weather, and a dozen other factors beyond democratic control. The one explanation that's never seriously considered is that the expedition failed because it was based on democratic delusions from the very beginning. As winter settles over a city that's lost not just an army, but its soul, you walk through streets that feel like the ruins of a civilization that hasn't quite realized it's dead yet. The agora still bustles with commerce. The assembly still meets on the mix. The temples still smoke with sacrificial offerings. But something fundamental has changed. Something that can never be repaired. Athens is still a democracy, but it's no longer free. The citizens still vote, but they vote from fear rather than hope, choosing safety over greatness, conformity over excellence, the known over the unknown. They've learnt the lesson that democracy teaches when it's pushed beyond its limits, that freedom is dangerous, that trust is weakness, that the only safe citizen is a frightened citizen. The democracy paradox has reached its logical conclusion. In their desperate attempt to remain free, the Athenians have voted themselves into a prison of their own making. They've discovered that tyranny doesn't require a tyrant. It just requires a people so afraid of being ruled that they'll rule themselves into the ground. The marble temples still gleam on the Acropolis. The triremes still patrol the harbor. And the assembly still echoes with the voices of free citizens debating the issues of the day. But the light has gone out of the great experiment, replaced by the cold glow of suspicion and fear. Sweet dreams, Alcibiades. Your betrayal has become your vindication. Your exile has become your escape. And your treason has become the mirror in which Athens finally sees itself clearly. The expedition you championed lies broken on Sicilian shores. The city you served has condemned you in absentia, and the democracy you embodied has transformed itself into everything it once opposed. But somewhere in Spartan exile, you alone understand the truth that Athens cannot face, that freedom and empire are incompatible, that democracy and domination cannot coexist, that the attempt to impose liberty through conquest leads inevitably to the conquest of liberty itself. The paradox is complete, the circle is closed, and tomorrow the sun will rise on an Athens that is still democratic in form but tyrannical in substance, still free in theory but enslaved in practice, still the teacher of nations but no longer the student of its own lessons.